Good morning. I'm going to start this presentation with a question. It's a question I have posed um, more than a few times in this class and other classes this semester. And I think it's probably one of the most important questions we can ask whenever we engage in any kind of a debate is, um, what if they're wrong? And what if we're wrong? This presentation will be a film review of the movie Not Evil, Just Wrong. My name is Paul Vaona, and again, I want to thank you for taking the time to review this presentation. So really, if we're going to look at the modern environmental movement, global change, climate change movement, we have to look at the past and where it started. And truthfully, the modern environmental movement started in the early 60s with the work of Rachel Carson. Of course, most people are familiar with the book Silent Spring. Silent Spring has since been, especially in the last decade or two, has been discredited by many top scientists. The biggest one, I guess one of the strongest proponents would be the best way to say it, J. Gordon Edwards uh, was a proponent of DDT, of its use, of its effective use. And interestingly, he used to take a spoonful of DDT in front of the audience before he began each one of his lectures. With the publishing of Silent Spring, that really created a movement that got DDT banned and decertified by the EPA, which was just starting out in the early 70s. It was decertified for use in the United States. This is after, decades upon decades of very successful mosquito and vector-borne illnesses. Prior to the 1930s, more soldiers died of disease than died of bullet wounds. In World War II, especially in the South Pacific, DDT was effectively used to remove much of, if not the entire, mosquito population of areas, and drastically reduce the diseases that these mosquitoes would bring. There's a cost when we go down this road. This book has been discredited for inaccuracies, falsities, uh, misrepresentation of data. Many scientists that were cited in this book have come out and basically said that this was not what their research was about. This is not the data. There are other things that have been pointed out by Dr. Edwards, how data was manipulated and massaged to fit in a very obvious bias. There were cases where the raptor birds and the soft shell problem that was with their young. It was found out later that the scientists were actually manipulating the food and reducing the amount of calcium in the diet of these raptor birds, which would obviously lead to soft shells. So when we go down this road, when people set out to fix a problem that they see as a problem, there's always going to be a cost. And if we look at the cost of something like malaria, what is the cost versus what is the benefit? Well, we know the cost today of malaria as about 212 million cases a year. Of those 212 million cases, roughly 500,000 will die. This number is actually an underestimate. As Professor Jared Diamond reported in his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, a lot of times when you go to these hospitals, the death will just be recorded as baby girl died. Because the child was so young, the family actually doesn't name the child because they know the likelihood of them surviving is pretty low, and so they'll just write it as baby girl, baby boy died. So this 500,000 is probably severely, or I should say significantly underestimated. Uh, Direct operating costs, this came from data from the CDC's. In the or excuse me, in the world, the direct cost of fighting the disease, of hospitalization, of the direct patient care is about $12 billion a year. And in the CDC report, they clearly state that this does not address the loss to the economy by people being taken out of the workforce, not being able to work, having to care for sick children. Um, so the loss in socioeconomics is beyond counting at this point. They can't even begin to estimate how high it would be. This map here is actually the only one I can find that clearly kind of gives a good picture. This is a map of yellow fever and the what's now we call the Zika virus, and you can see in the 1930s the mosquitoes, the population. In 1970s, when DDT was still being used, you can see there in the middle, it's a significant reduction. And then after Silent Spring, well, then and obviously the area has returned, and if anything, it looks like it's grown because of this, because of the socioeconomic impact. The United Nations has begun to allow the limited use. I'm not really clear on what that is of DDT as of 2006 in Africa. And they're starting to get a hold of it. There's a great report out of South Africa that the malaria death, you can look at the graph, and unfortunately I wasn't able to capture it because it wasn't a movie. You can look at the malaria deaths, and I think it's in the movie I'm reviewing. Um, After DDT was banned, and it just increased exponentially, and as they reintroduced the use of DDT, the drop was as significant as the rise. So it's very clear that DDT has played a very important role in the control. So the movie Not Evil, Just Wrong. This was kind of a rebuttal to Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. It was directed and produced by Anne McElhenney and Phyla McAley. They're both Irish, and I'm sure I'm butchering that. It was put out in 2009. Both of these filmmakers have a history of making movies related to environmental issues, especially those um, how these environmental policies and these environmentals impact everyday people, people that go to work and try and make a living. One movie is Fracking USA. Another really good one would be Mine, M-I-N-E, Mind Your Own Business. Really, what started this was a case brought before the British High Court in which some families was very concerned about this movie, An Inconvenient Truth, that was to be played in the British school system. And it was being presented as if this was peer-reviewed research. Um, they took this all the way to the British High Court, and the judge sitting there cited 9 specific inaccuracies, very blatantly obvious ones, and you can read them here. A Because of this, they were not allowed to present this as peer-reviewed research type material. Unfortunately, that did not prevent them from showing the movie. They just didn't. They could not present it as scientific research. Of course, when you're dealing with children, they're not going to understand the difference. And in the movie, they point that out. So what are the impacts of the climate movement? Well, the first thing we have to consider is actions have consequences. No matter what we do, whether we take an action or even inactions have consequences. So if actions have consequences, then obviously it's a correlation that greater actions have greater consequences. So if we start off with that, as the greater our actions, the greater things are done, the more effect it's going to have. So let's move on to the first side of the argument. So really what the movie was about was they were presenting the other side, the effects, the consequences of these environmental policies on everyday people. But they also presented both sides of it. They did show the environmentalists, and I thought that they were very respectful to the environmentalists. And of course, with the environmentalists came the famous consensus. And I've pointed this out before. Consensus is not a basis of science. One of the great thinkers has an idea of consensus. Matter of fact, Aristotle, a student of Plato, considers the argument from consensus as one of the 12 great fallacies of an argument. It's referred to as, let's see if my Latin is still good, argumentum ad populum, which is essentially the head count fallacy. So when somebody presents the argument of consensus, something related to science, or really anything, I argue that consensus means nothing, because there is no scientific means of testing consensus. At least we forget that there was a time when the consensus was the world was flat and all the planets and the sun revolved around the Earth, and that was a consensus. Another important thing to figure out, or not to figure out, to address is when you pick your specialist, you pick your diagnosis. And let me give you an example. A man gets hit in the chest with a baseball. It's going to hurt. So he goes to see a doctor because his chest hurts. Well, if he goes to a cardiologist, the cardiologist is going to tell him he has a heart attack. If he goes to see a pulmonologist, a respiratory doc, doc's going to tell him he's having an asthma attack. And of course, if he sees a psychiatrist, he's going to tell him it's all in his head. So when you present data, numbers, figures, or data, when you present that to a climatologist, is it any surprise of what the conclusion they're going to draw? You know, in the movie, they discussed Professor Michael Mann's hockey stick, which was cited for many years as the absolute proof, beyond any further debate, that global warming is real. Again, this is something that has been discredited. When the movie talks about a mathematician, a specialist in statistics, and they gave him these numbers, and he ran these numbers, it didn't add up. He contacted Mann several times, are these the numbers that you use? And yes, they are. And he finally went back to him and said, look, these numbers are not adding up. At which point Mann never spoke to him again and just basically said, he's too busy to deal with him. He's not refuting the evidence. He just doesn't want to deal with it. The same with them. There's a scientist for the Goddard Center for NASA, and his take on this data, which again, was no one's fighting or saying that the data is incorrect. His answer is that the negative side of this data is it confuses people. So by looking at this data, by letting it run by somebody who doesn't have a dog in the fight, as it were, that confuses people. So the consensus says the science is over. But are there alternating ideas? Well, a simple research, and some that I've brought up in this class before, is that there are. And these are not people in the pay of big oil, as people like to point out. One of which is Dr. Ivor Giver, and I'm going to pronounce this really bad. Um, Dr. Guyver is a Nobel Prize winning physicist, won the Nobel Prize in 1973, and was a member of the Physics Society for the United States, or for America, I don't remember what group, and he was asked to make a presentation at one of their meetings on climate change. So he attacked the problem as any passionate Nobel laureate scientist would, and he started doing a lot of research and a lot of data, and he had a lot of concerns. His concerns were the data was incorrect. The collection of data, we're relying on temperatures taken 100 years ago by people that probably weren't as well trained. He brings up in one of the lectures here that the cited reason for being worried about climate change, the rise in temperature falls within the error margin of some of these thermometers. And then the one, probably the most telling question that he asks is, what is the optimum temperature? No one will tell us. Well, we know it's been a lot hotter. We know it's been a lot colder. We know that we've had more carbon dioxide in the air. We know we've had less. And this has been going on for years and years. In his lecture, he talked about the sea level rise and the citing of that being a concern and an indication of climate change. And what he pointed out is that the sea level rise for the last 100 years that have been cited as the irrefutable proof that there is climate change and it is man-made, is that the the sea level rise for the previous 100 years has been the same rate as the sea level rise the 100 years before that and the 100 years before that. If you look at this graph of the sea level rise, it actually hasn't risen that much, and it's actually been relatively flat. Our environment has probably been more stable than it has in the past. Well, we have another scientist, again, not a crackpot, not somebody in the pay of big oil, Dr. William Harper, professor of atomic physics, optics, and spectroscopy, is pretty much an expert on carbon dioxide. This has been his work for 20, 30 years, working with lasers and carbon dioxide. He is an expert on carbon dioxide. And you have to preface by saying carbon dioxide is a gas that's in the air all the time. We exhale carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a key component of life. Life could not exist on this planet without carbon dioxide. But when we think of carbon dioxide, at least when the climate change people want us to think of it, they want us to look at the big smokestack and see what coming out as being carbon dioxide. Well, what's coming out actually is more than anything else is sweat and other harmful chemicals that, yes, should be addressed. But what they bring out, especially in this program, is that carbon dioxide is actually a necessary component of life. We need CO2. Well, Dr. Happer is telling us that we're actually in a carbon dioxide drought, that the plants and material, the plants have actually had to go through a change on a DNA level to deal with this drought. That at times when we've had more carbon dioxide, that there has been more plant life. So the scare tactic of, well, all the plants are going to die off. Ask any good greenhouse. They pump carbon dioxide into the greenhouse to get them to grow more. So carbon dioxide is actually plant food. And again, this is this, and I've used this before, this graph before. This is the ice core, the Vostok ice core sampling, and it's showing temperature rises over the last 400,000 years. We're nowhere near being at some of the most maximum temperatures we've had. Again, when there has been massive amounts of plant growth. There was a time, again, this was removed from Dr. Mann's hockey stick, the medieval warming period, when England was exporting wine because northern England, they were growing grapes. We often joke about Greenland and then the I don't want to call it a wives' tale, but the story goes that the Vikings purposely mislabeled Greenland and Iceland to confuse people. That wasn't true. There was a time when Greenland was not snow covered. It was actually very green, very lush. Um, this was the medieval warming period. This was removed from Professor Mann's research because it didn't fit his narrative. So, if we accept that actions have consequences, and greater actions have consequences, then what are the consequences of these in enacting these policies that the Green Movement wants us to enact? And that's really what the movie addresses, probably more than anything else. They follow one family, and they talk a few people, but they really follow one family, and that family, um, poor area, the country, the father of two, was working at a fast food restaurant. I mean, they were having to borrow money to pay bills. It was pretty rough story. Gets a job working in a muffler factory. He sees a significant rise in his income. His family, his wife, they're trying to take care of their kids. They're trying to put food on the table. They're trying to make sure their kids have an opportunity to have a life better than theirs, to go to school. Well, now he's making a lot more money. They moved out of this, and again, this becomes stereotypical. They moved out of their trailer home, and they're moving into a house, and they have an opportunity. So there's a cost, and that's what really the movie is trying to address. And so when I go out and do some research here, and this comes from an industry website for the petroleum industry. And as of 2017, what they've identified is there are about little over 1.39 million direct petroleum jobs. These are not people that have anything to do like the gentleman in the movie making mufflers or other ancillary jobs. These are direct petroleum jobs. And how is this going to be affected? Well, about a decade ago, a little bit more, there was a big push. All the countries in Europe were installing windmills. They couldn't put them up fast enough. The governments were giving all kinds of subsidies. If you had any arable land, you were, forget farming, cropping, you were going to throw a windmill up on it. And there was a study done in Spain by the Spanish government, and what they found is that for every one green job that is produced, there is a loss of 3 traditional jobs. So again, we do some fancy math, and if you look at a little over 1.39 million people in the United States, we're looking over 1 million net job loss just in the petroleum industry. Now, there was some people going around. This was during the last presidency, Obama's presidency, when people were asking, well, what are we expecting the coal miners in Kentucky and West Virginia? And very flippantly, they talk to these green people, and they're like, well, they should learn to code. As if that's a real possibility for a West Virginia coal miner. In the movie Not Evil, Just Wrong, at a green convention, that was one of the things they said. Well, they should just get online and of course I'm paraphrasing, but they're like, they should just get online and see where their jobs are going, and that's what they should do. It's not an option for these people. There's kind of an arrogance with some of these people, some of these green people, and again, these jobs are going. These green policies are going to have a huge effect, and they're not addressing that. They're not even considering it. You can't just get a job coding. Let's talk about the cost. What's going to be the cost as far as dollars and cents? In 2014, MIT did a study, and they calculated that it was going to take roughly $44 trillion between now and 2050 to effectively attack the global warming problem. If anything, this is probably a conservative estimate. There's a lot more that wasn't considered. But if we just look at the 44 trillion, and at the time, that was 36 years away. So again, doing some fancy math, we're looking at about $1.2 trillion a year taken out of the economy, taken away from being able to use for other things to improve people's standards of living. And again, something addressed in the movie that's very readily available as far as information is, who are these policies going to hurt the worst? All the environmental policies that they pass in California. Victor Hansen, professor, wrote a great article, a great essay on this. The policies are written by people on the extreme West Coast. People live in the coastal areas, San Francisco, Los Angeles. But they're affecting the people in the central and eastern part of the state. So when they write a policy about making air conditioners almost impossible to use, or power bills so expensive, it's not really affecting them. One, they're probably a little bit better off socioeconomically. Two, they're not really running their air conditioners that much. But if you go to Central California, people are going to Walmart and hanging out at Walmart simply because they can't afford the power to run their air conditionings. So who are the people that are most affected by this in a negative way? And they're the most poor and the most vulnerable people. When Rachel Carlson wrote Silent Spring and when DDT was banned, it didn't affect her. It didn't affect the people that live in Colorado and Wyoming and Washington and Idaho and California. It didn't affect them. The effect was felt on those people in Africa, in Central Africa and other countries where you have yellow fever, where you have malaria. How much have they lost? So let's ask another question. What if I'm right? In an argument, to be a well-constructed argument, you have to consider the other person's position. You have to consider what happens if you're wrong. What happens if the environmentalists are wrong? What happens to the economy? Well, even if we consider the 44 trillion, although that number has skyrocketed more and more, if all these policies are enacted, the best research, and this even comes from the IPCC, is that the reduction in global temperature by the end of the century will be a fraction of a degree centigrade. So we're talking worldwide, not just the United States. We're talking, 100 trillion or more. Interestingly, we can't consider China or India because their policy, their stated policy is that they will not follow any policy that reduces their ability to compete on an industrial level. So they will not follow any type of carbon policy. So we're going to spend if not hundreds of trillions of dollars for a fraction of a degree centigrade improvement. What if I'm right? What if it really isn't? And there is research that shows this is, more related to solar. There's many researchers that are saying the same thing. What if we're right? Then we take all of this money out of the economy. We take the ability for these countries in Central Africa and South America. We're taking away from their ability to raise themselves socioeconomically. We're taking away their chance to raise their standard of living. And it's irrefutable that the number one way to reduce pollution is to increase your standard of living. You're less dependent on dirty technology the higher your standard of living. If you want to look at something as simple as cars, You can afford a better car, a less polluting car. You can afford to heat your house. You can afford to use forms of energy that are less polluting. So the big question is, who's going to bear the cost of enacting the policies? So how would I rate this film? Well, I give it 3 stars. Um, I give it 3 out of 4. I know the Rubik says out of 5, but I'm a fan of great movies. The Great Gatsby, All Quiet on the Western Front, Das Boot. Those are 5s, so those are eliminated. That level's eliminated. Um, it was well presented, and I think they presented both sides. Um, I think they gave a very clear example that there are alternative thoughts, um, that there is no consensus, that there are people out there, very learned, very intelligent people, that are questioning it. Um, and I think the most important thing is that they highlighted the cost. I think that was probably the best thing, and I'm sure that's what this movie was about, really, is the regular Americans, um, the people in Africa and Central Africa, these developing nations. Um, those are the people that are going to bear the cost. You and I, we'll see our electric bill go up. We'll be inconvenienced, but much like um, DDT, the removal of DDT has cost lives. This policy, this global warming policy, will cost lives. And these are some of the references. I could probably put about 1,000 more. Again, I'm relying on much of this to be that I've used is based on common knowledge, on things that are out there that are not really in question. Um, and let's see. And I think I think I've covered pretty much everything. Of course, I have to give credit to to my motivation. I have to point out the little bottom right picture. The girls got to go with me to class when they're up here on their spring break and be guest lecturers in one of my classes of a game they made up. So I want to thank all of you for your time. And if I can leave you with one thing and one thing only is a question. Don't assume, and don't take everything just because somebody says there's a consensus. Have a great day.